See the Hello, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Today I have a very special opportunity to introduce our guest from Italy, but first I must underline that this presentation is going to be part of our cooperation with the Association of Hispanists of Serbia, and here is today with us Jelena, the president of that association. As you know, this year we are doing together 8 Latin American summer school here in Belgrade. So today with us we have a professor, Dr. Đan Luka Gardini. He's going to speak about a topic called contextualized and positive assessment of EU-LAC relations. LAC is, of course, Latin America and Caribbean. I will say briefly a few words about our guest. Đan Luka Gardini is a full professor and chair of Department of History of International Relations with a focus on Latin America at the University of Udiine in Italy. From 2014 to 2021, he was the chair of International Business and Public Relations with a focus on Latin America and the Faculty of Business, Economics, and Social Sciences of Friedrich-Alexander University. He previously taught at the University of Cambridge and the University of Bat in the United Kingdom. His main research interests include Latin American international relations, foreign policy analysis, comparative regional integration, international organizing, and issues of international power, order, and institutions. Among his recent books are External Powers in Latin America, edited by Routledge in 2021, and The World Before and After COVID-19, edited by EIIC in 2020. And of course, today we are actually speaking about something that is related with Gardini's latest published book called The Redefinition of the EU Presence in Latin America and the Caribbean, edited by Peter Langa Vерлаг in 2023, for which he received Claudија Castaneda Prize for Best Book, awarded by the Chilean Political Science Association. So, dear director, now you can say a few words.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. First of all, I'm really happy that I can greet Professor Gardini, and it's great honor and pleasure having you with us today. And also, I have to say that I'm happy that I can finally greet our long time friend and collaborator who will be our lecturer today. This is Professor Jose Angel Ruiz Jimenez, who have just arrived with the other participants of the summer school. And I just wanted, since I returned, unfortunately I couldn't participate on Monday when the whole event actually started, in which it was great thing. I think that this year it started with a presentation of opus magnum of our colleague Rajko Petrović, who has published, as you all know, 2-volume book about the Latin America. This is the first achievement of that kind, in which he is really doing some, we could say, complete overview of the political system ideologies. So it's some kind of Baedeker that we didn't have here. When I speak about that ourselves, it's not only about Serbia, but the whole Balkans, more or less. Of course, we always have to remind ourselves about the people who have started Latin American studies, and always I have to remind us about His Excellency Trivo Indžić, our colleague who passed away several years ago, with whom I had a great privilege and luck to work. Already in the 90s, they started with the library, with the Center for Latin American Studies. Hopefully, Professor Pajević, who participated at that time, is still active and still working very much in promotion of this kind of interest. But I'm really happy that with Rajko and with Jelena and the people who are dealing with participating in the work of Association of the Hispanists of Serbia, we have already for 8 years, of course, not to forget Dejan Mihajlović, our initiator and professor for University Monterrey, Technological University of Monterrey, who have helped us very much. But now it's, I just wanted to tell Professor Gardini that we made some nice circle that is expanding. Last year we had Professor Malamud with us, who then recommended you, which is very great thing and honor for us and so on. So I'm really happy that we made one very good, if I could say, basis, and we hope that this will develop in the future times and expand much more interest together with our already established cooperation with our Minister of Foreign Affairs, with ambassadors who are working at the field and so on. So I'm really happy that with a small amount, Your Excellency, please join us here. We are really happy to address another friend of ours, His Excellency, Senor Marsico, who is, you will have the chance to meet him after that. Ambassador of Republic Argentina here, our former lecturer, I have to emphasize that, and somebody who also helped us very much even last year and this year with this great idea, if I could say. And without further ado, I'm really happy that since I'm finishing my obligation as somebody who managed and helped this thing, I'm really happy that we are leaving this whole project on a very good basis, and I hope that in the future it will be really what Jelena has expected, one very important, if I could say, center for the development and dealing with Latin American, Ibero-American studies, and finally ICA that is about to be organized next year in Novi Sad at the Philosophy Faculty of Novi Sad, of course with our friend Bojana Kovačević-Petrović as Spiritus Movens there with our help. Is really great honor in a way for all the things that we've been doing here. And what Jelena always emphasized is really with the right that we are trying to make some kind of, let me say, combination of philological literature studies on one hand and political and geopolitical, economical, I could say politicological on the other hand. And that's really, so your great contribution will be on that part, if I could say, of course, together, just not forget, tomorrow we are starting at 12 with presentation of Professor Ruiz Jimenez, fantastic history of Yugoslavia and the states that were created out of Yugoslavia, which is in Spanish, but we will have the chance to present that in English for the audience. Without further ado, thank you very much for coming, being with us, and Rajko, please lead us further.
And I will just add one brief information. We have today with us also our colleague from Ecuador, who is doing his master thesis, PhD thesis in Budapest. We met. We met a year and a half ago, and I had the extraordinary opportunity to speak with him a few days ago about my chapter in the book dedicated to Ecuador, and he was impressed that there is someone here in Serbia who is dealing with that. So please, Professor, now we can start with your presentation.
Thank you. If you don't mind, can you hear me? Can you all hear me? If you don't mind, I will stand because I spend so much time sitting that I really cannot wait to move a little bit around. First of all, let me thank you very, very warmly, the people who made my visit to Belgrade possible, and that's especially Jelena and the Association of the Hispanists, and of course the Institute and the colleagues, Professor Misha and Professor Rajko. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure and a honor to see the ambassador of Argentina here and our friend from Ecuador, because I'm Italian, but my heart has been Argentinized as I lived and studied in Buenos Aires, and my wife is Ecuadorian. So thank you for making me feel really, really at home, not only for the very warm welcome that I have received in Belgrade, but also for this quite familiar context that I see around myself. As Professor Rajko said, I would like to share with you some ideas about the redefinition of the presence of the European Union in Latin America and the Caribbean, a redefinition that has been going on forever and ever. Every time that the European Union issues a new paper, a new document, a new plan reshaping its relations with Latin America and the Caribbean, this is called a new beginning, a relaunch, a new start. And I'm always a little bit skeptical of this innovation at all costs. Also because I hope I will be able to argue that the relationship between Latin America and the Caribbean on the one hand, and the European Union on the other, does not need any new start. It's already a very good, solid, cordial, and fruitful relationship. So we don't need to start anything anew, but in my very humble view, we should really build on what we already have, which is a lot. And that's why the title of the presentation, it's a little bit of a provocation. The European Union is known as a normative power, civilian power. So the idea is that the role of the European Union internationally is somehow based on values. However, new currents, new trends in geopolitics suggest that you cannot live only on values, because you have to live together with people who will not necessarily share your own values, but you have to get along with them nonetheless. And that's where theory of international relations, theory of foreign policy analysis tell us that what really shapes foreign policy is interest. However, I want to make a step further, and this is what this 35 to 40 minutes conversation is about. Is there a meeting point between interests and values? Because a foreign policy dictated by interest only would be sheer opportunism. I just grasp the opportunities that the system gives to me without any medium or long-term plan. But a foreign policy based exclusively on values would be extremely demagogic, would be essentially utopia, in the hope of living in a world that you can shape beyond your own agency capacity. And here comes the idea, or the two big ideas behind
We have the problem with all the claimants are working.
Yeah, perfect. And here come two ideas to link theory of IR and the practice of IR. Let me tell you a personal anecdote. I'm not an academic by training. I worked in Brussels for 4 years dealing every day with the European institutions. And let me tell you, they don't work in the way in which you read in your books and articles. They work exactly in the same way as all political organizations work, based on power, interest, and where and when possible on values. So I don't want to exclude values from the picture, but I want to include values in a certain context. And the two big points I want to make before we start are the following. When you look at relations between the European Union, Latin America, and the Caribbean, you can easily observe two tensions. The first is between values and interests, the one we have already discussed. I'll just wait for that to be ready. No worries.
We are trying to reduce that, so...
No worries.
Sorry.
That's okay. As an Italian who studied in Argentina, you know, I'm used to improvise when something happens, so don't worry.
It's the masters of improvisation. It's like always.
Well, join the queue, ambassador. They have to join our queue. I think we are the masters. We do the best, or we give the best of ourselves in contingency rather than in planning. Okay, so the first tension is between values and interest, okay? But there is a second tension between agency and structure. That is, to what extent agents, Argentinian politicians and diplomats, European Union politicians and diplomats can run their foreign policy without taking into account the context. And they cannot. No social phenomena takes place in a vacuum. We all live in a context. Vacuum exists only in laboratory experiments, in physics, for instance, but not in the social sciences. So if you look at the context and you realize the context in which Latin America and the Caribbean and the European Union have to deal with one another, you will realize that that context is a difficult one for both parties. And the fact that in spite of that context, we have a very solid, cordial, and fruitful relation should be valued, much more than we tend to do in academia. Generally, you make a good academic career when you criticize institutions. I'm very proud to say that I made my little career by praising institutions and by giving values to what we have and to what works. So the plan of the talk is a very short introduction to EU, Latin America, and the Caribbean relations beyond the rhetoric of values. So let's try to go beyond that. Then I'll tell you a few more words on this debate between the capacity of agents and the context in which they act. Then we will look at the actual state of EU-LAC relations to show you that these relations are extremely positive and we should be very proud. Can we do better? Of course we can. That's for sure. But if you want to invest in a relationship, same with your partners, same with your family and friends, when you invest in a relationship, that comes with a cost. Is Latin America, is the European Union ready and willing to bear the cost of further investing in the mutual relations? Maybe so, but we will see that it's not that easy. And then I will give you some very humble proposals in point number 4. That is, if we look at the big political agenda, it's relatively easy to find clashes. Not all countries in Europe and Latin America understand democracy, human rights, the rule of law in the same way. They all say they value it, but what they value is actually something different. They understand it in a different way. So my point is there enough space to leave aside for the moment the big political issues and concentrate on a functional agenda? And my answer is yes. And the functional agenda is very cheap, but is potentially very fruitful to deepen further relations between Latin America and the Caribbean and the European Union. And then, if time allows, I would like to show you a final point. That is, the European Union has been consistently trying to promote its own model of integration to other parts of the world. But that's impossible. The EU cannot be a model. The EU can be a reference, meaning that other regions of the world face the same problems that the European Union has already faced when integrating. So the EU can provide an example of how you can deal with those problems, but you cannot translate the European Union experience into a different context. That said, I will try to draw some very tentative conclusions, because our life, thanks God, is constantly evolving. So any sort of conclusion could only be tentative. Let me show you a typical misunderstanding that both academics and policy makers make. And I take the example of the highest representative of the European diplomacy. That's the High Representative. But no worries, I'll tell you the story, I know it almost by heart. Josep Borrell, who is the High Representative for European Foreign Policy and Security, when he took office, he wrote a very interesting piece trying to suggest ways to improve Latin American-European Union relations. And Borrell made a sorry, it's the previous one, I think. Let me see. No, it's this one. Yeah, this one. And Borrell made a very interesting observation. He said, in spite of having much in common, European-Latin American interactions are still far below their potential, which may be true. I'm not going to question that. But I would like to ask, and I did, Mr. Borrell, two questions. The first is, what do we actually have in common? And he answered that question. But he was unable to answer the second and more important one. I said, Mr. Borrell, but what is the expectation? So what is your target? If you say that we are below potential, what is your target? And that's where we have a problem, because it's very difficult to define a target in bi-regional relations. But let me show you the first answer. In the same article, Mr. Borrell said, we actually share language, culture, history, religion with Latin America, and an important part of Latin American population are descendants of European migrants for the last 5 centuries. All good. But should this direct foreign policy? I mean, if this kind of commonalities directed foreign policy, the EU should have no relation with China, with which we don't share any language, culture, history, or religion. The same applies to most countries around the world. So that's an interesting starting point, but we should unpack it. So it's not values that make foreign policy. It is interest. But interests are not alien to values. And that's where geopolitics, I understand that this institute has a strong interest in and focus on geopolitics. So do I. And I'm a follower of one of the new trends in geopolitics, that is human geopolitics, meaning that the center of politics is human beings. What is the European Union? Is people who organize themselves in such a way that they do or they try to do something good for other people, that they identify as the European community of nations. And if that is the case, we should really ask ourselves, but do the European Union and Latin America constitute a community of shared values? And I would be skeptical about that. Because you can make this argument with the majority of Latin American countries, but not with all of them. Latin America is as diverse as you can imagine. You know, when I hear people talking about Latin America and generalizing, I get mad. I mean, Argentina is a continent, Brazil is a continent. But tell me, do you really think that a Swedish person and a Serbian person are very similar? A Portuguese and a Bulgarian? Well, South America is 4 times as big as the European Union. Think about it. So if you think that you can make one thing of Latin America, then think twice. Latin America is very varied. So here comes the problem. If you look at the issues that are at the core of the values of the European Union, you will see that not all Latin American countries and Caribbean countries, for that sake, St. Vincent and the Grenadines are a typical example, agree on those values. Let's take the European stance on the war in Ukraine. I guess we are all for peace and we all condemn war. Anybody against this statement? No, thank you. So the United Nations General Assembly condemned the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. But when the UN adopted that resolution, a number of Latin American countries abstained. One wanted to vote against, that's Venezuela, but they hadn't paid their contribution to the UN, so they were not even allowed to vote. A few days after that, February 24th, few days after that, also the Organization of the American States approved a similar resolution condemning Russian invasion. And in that case, a number of Latin American countries abstained, and the major country was one of those countries that abstained. That's Brazil. At some point, the United Nations realized the extent, the massive extent of human rights violation in Ukraine. And the UN adopted a resolution to suspend, not to expel, to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council. Believe it or not, a number of Latin American countries voted against that resolution and 3 abstained. Among those 3 are 2 of the major Latin American powers, that is Mexico and Brazil again. So if you really think that you have a community of values, think twice, because Latin America is a very diverse continent. I'm not saying that a majority of Latin American countries has not condemned the invasion. I'm saying that there are significant exceptions, sadly, as the Chilean diplomacy put it, sadly. Second problem, democracy, free and fair elections. With all due respect, Cuba is still a dictatorship according to all canons of judgment. Venezuela might have had elections, but they were very far from being fair and free. So it's at least an illiberal democracy. Nicaragua follows suit. And what about the situation in Haiti? So even the understanding of democracy is very varied inside Latin America and the Caribbean, and it makes it difficult to make an understanding at the bi-regional level. What about respect for human rights? These are not my words, but the words of Michelle Bachelet, former president of Chile, former head of the UN Human Rights Commission, who actually said that the UN is extremely concerned with the situation of human rights in Latin America, and even more worrisome, threats to human rights come from government and official state institutions. Not my word. Word of the former Chilean president. So a voice inside Latin America. And if you look at the latest EU CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States Summit, we are all very pleased that, in fact, we finally had a summit after 8 years, but all trumpeted celebrations about this summit were actually misplaced. Because it's great that we had the summit, but the final declaration had 41 points, meaning there is no real direction. Let me tell you, I worked for the Chilean Foreign Ministry when we organized the first EU CELAC summit back in 2013 in Santiago. And we made an effort to reduce the number of points from the all-time record 104 of the Guadalajara Declaration to a little bit less than 40. I think it was 38 or 39. Also, in the roadmap that followed the summit, the usual topics were identified. What is the common interest between the EU and Latin America? Commodities, as usual. Organized crime, as usual. Global financial stability, as usual, even more so after the conflict in Ukraine, and the three transitions, green, digital, and social. In spite of this summit not proposing anything spectacular, there was no final joint declaration. I'm sure that the ambassador will look at me with skeptical eyes, because we, in fact, had a final joint declaration. Pity. One country, Nicaragua, did not agree on one article, meaning that there is no joint declaration as a whole. So, 33 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, one was against one article. Latin America could not present itself as a unitary front. So, my personal conclusion is that there is not really a shared community of values, and it is even difficult to talk about a strategic alliance. Does it mean that there is nothing good? No, this is not what I'm saying. I'm saying that we should be very realistic and very pragmatic. Not insist too much on values, but insist on interest. What can we do together? And we already do a lot of things. Europeans and Latin Americans and Caribbeans are already doing a lot of things. And we can build on that. Also because, before telling you all the wonderful things that Latin America and the European Union already do together, let me return to the second problem. So the first is this tension between values and interest. But the second one is the tension between agents, what Latin American and European politicians and diplomats can do before a difficult, objectively difficult context. Look at, I selected 8 elements that are not just a sort of momentary element, but are characteristics, probably enduring characteristics of the international system, at least for the next few years. First, we still live in a post-pandemic context. It's not true that it's over. Many countries are now trying to implement a more autonomous strategy internationally rather than a cooperative strategy, because they want to avoid to be exposed to sudden disruptions. The European Union is trying, for instance, to shorten its supply value chains. China is doing the same, by the way. So what remains for Latin America, thinking in terms of international insertion strategy? Second point, the rise of China. China is conquering a lot of space, political, economic, cultural in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the European Union has to face a situation that is not necessarily propitious to its own diplomatic action. And this cannot be blamed on China, on Latin America, or the European Union. It just things as they are. Third problem, globalization is in transition. So the world we have known for the last 20 to 30 years is actually fast changing. But the problem is not that we are deglobalizing, because if you look at figures, in fact, we produce more and more, and we trade and export more and more, but to shorter distances. That's the real innovation. That's the real change as compared to 10 years ago, when many countries were actually making their value chains longer. Now they're trying to shorten supply and sale. Fourth problem, multilateralism is in crisis, at least the Western type of multilateralism. The UN, the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, for one reason or another, they are all losing credibility and power. But there is a different multilateralism that hinges around China that is in fact flourishing. But the European Union is part of the other multilateralism, the one that is in decline. And region-to-region relations are a piece of this multilateralism. So it's very difficult for the EU to gain more space in Latin America. The US, the major ally of the European Union, is losing ground not only in Latin America, but the US is redefining its presence internationally. So the European Union has somehow lost one leg in its international insertion strategy. And it's not only Trump. Protectionism is in the spirit of the nation these days in the United States. So it's not just a Trumpite argument. Joe Biden and Obama actually started that discourse when Joe Biden was vice president in the Obama administration. By the way, interesting thing, in this unpropitious context, the EU has shown a lot of resilience. You can criticize the European Union, but the European Union is not losing as much ground as you may think. Of course, its space is being eroded. Nobody wants to deny that. But certainly less, for instance, than the space that the US has lost in Latin America, at least in the last 20 years. The war in Ukraine, and most recently the conflict in Gaza, have shown again differences in the approach between the European Union and Latin American countries. And again, I would invite you not to blame the usual suspects in Latin America, because there is also a mentality behind that is different. For the European Union, international fora are the right place where to condemn international wrongdoings. In the Latin American tradition, international fora are the places where to engage those that commit wrongdoings. These are not the places where to stigmatize. These are the places where to maintain dialogue. But of course, there is a problem to make the two approaches meet. And final thing, there is a structural difficulty that Latin America has been facing for the last 100 years. According to all major indicators of international insertion, proportion of population, proportion of world GDP, proportion of trade, diplomatic capacity, military projection, Latin America has been declining in the last 100 years. There is an article by two compatriots of yours, Ambassador Andres Malamud, whom we have already mentioned, and who is to be blamed for my presence here, and Luis Schenoni, two very well-known international scholars who have given evidence of this decline of Latin America. So also for the European Union, it's difficult to invest in a continent that is actually declining. And for Latin America, if you perceive yourself as a declining continent, you tend to arrange to prepare defensive strategies, not to lose more ground, rather than being proactive. José Antonio Sanauja, who is the major political advisor to Josep Borrell, has just published an article, you can Google it, about the major lack of presence and visibility of Latin America in the world context. So even Josep Borrell has this kind of message that arrives from his advisors. So why should he invest more in Latin America, in spite of the fact that he's a great friend of Latin America? He even conducted business there before becoming foreign minister of Spain. So this is the context. In spite of all these difficulties, let me show you how good the relations between the EU and Latin America and the Caribbean are. The situation is the following. The European Union is still and by far the larger cooperation donor to Latin America and the Caribbean. The European Union is still the first investor in Latin America in terms of stock. That is, assets that are already present and working in Latin America and the Caribbean. We're not talking about wonderful, marvelous promises of future investment or current flows. China, in spite of all the discourse, accounts for less than 1/10 in terms of stock of investment as compared to the European Union. 1 to 10. The EU remains the third major trade partner for Latin America and the Caribbean, with very significant differences. Countries or areas where the EU is really marginal and countries where the EU is prominent. I'll take the example of Cuba, where in spite of proximity to the US, the EU plays a major trading role. And if you think historically, as I like to do, because I think that things don't happen in a vacuum, we are the product of what has happened before our time. Well, the historical pattern has always been the same. There are ups and downs in the relationship between the European Union and Latin America and the Caribbean. Take the last, 30 years. A lot of enthusiasm in the 1990s. The fall of the Berlin Wall, Latin America returns to democracy, opens its economies to the world, Europeans go and invest there, and there is a commonality of interest and values. Then with the 2008 financial crisis, there is economic stalemate in Europe, but Latin America is actually surfing quite well through the crisis, and therefore there is a mismatch. Latin America starts looking at Asia, and the EU starts losing ground. Then there is COVID-19, and we have more problems. On the one hand, the EU again has its wonderful discourse. Listen to us, be democratic, respect the rule of law, and we will give you medical equipment. At the same time, when the Russians and the Chinese were actually giving that medical equipment, not promising it. Let's not discuss about the quality of what the Russians and the Chinese sent to Latin America. That's another point. But if I have no access to the vaccine, it's better to have a poor vaccine than none. And if you take even the last 5 years, see these up and downs. 2019, I remember there was a lot of pessimism. No summit for 4 years, no real advance in all trade negotiations, and all of a sudden the EU and Mercosur announced that they reached a political agreement for 20 years negotiation. Fantastic. And then nothing happened. The following year, COVID-19 basically stopped everything. Another 2 years, and Germany says, we are the major power in Europe and we will make Latin America a focus in our foreign policy. I was there when Foreign Minister Heiko Maas announced that. Then the German presidency of the European Union comes and Germany forgets about Latin America. Sorry, there is a pandemic, we have other priorities. Fair enough. But if you were a Latin American, how would you react? You tell us first that we will become your priority, and then you look at the plan of the presidency, and Latin America is right at the bottom with a little mention. Not nice, isn't it? Then, last year, we had the summit, so again, more enthusiasm, forgetting sometimes that the year before, something major happened, but was not noticed. There was a digital alliance between the EU and Latin America, with a lot of concrete money going through European channels onto Latin America. There are a number of initiatives to counter Chinese infrastructure projects in Latin America with the EU Global Gateway. Of course, the amount of money is not the same, but Brussels is making an effort. So if you think that this is the situation, we have to be realistic. Europe is not a priority for Latin America, it's one of the options, and Latin America is not a priority for Europe, neither in economic terms nor in political terms. Migrants come from Africa, not from Latin America here into Europe in big numbers. Our trade as Europeans is essentially with Asia and the US. Our cooperation priority, Africa. Spain and Portugal insist on Latin America, but France especially, Belgium, have other priorities, not to talk about Britain when they were a member of the European Union. So I really think that if we are realistic, we should be positive and optimistic. This bilateral relationship is already very good. And if we want to make it better, of course we can. But are we really willing to invest in making it better? Because if we want to do that, we should do something on both sides. On the European side, we should certainly improve our communication strategy. We should be clearer with Latin Americans and Caribbeans. We should go for a complete rebranding of the image of the EU in Latin America, which is positive, by the way, according to all surveys, but not as positive as the image of the US or China, for God's sake. We should also be more politically coherent. Germany was not the only country to announce big plans for Latin America. The following presidency after Germany was Portugal, and everybody expected a shift of European interest towards Latin America, or at least towards Brazil, but that did not materialize. So if the EU promises something or generates expectations, then it has to deliver. That's how you build credibility. And third, there is an opportunity cost. As a European, if you invest in Latin America, you cannot invest somewhere else. Is it really worth doing that? But also look at the Latin American side. Now the big flow of money and trade in Latin America arrives from China and other rising powers. So why to invest massively in Europe? You can do that, but it's not exactly the top priority of many Latin American countries. Take the example of Argentina, that has a very long and solid relationship with Europe, not just for the migrants, but for a number of reasons. But now China is the main trade partner of the country. So even Argentina has to think about it. Hey, who buys my soybeans? Who buys my cereals and grains? Big question. Political cost and political will. You can certainly move the focus of your attention towards Europe. Let's take, for instance, the green transition. But the green transition can generate a lot of new jobs. We know that in Europe. That applies to Latin America. The Inter-American Development Bank and the International Labour Organization have estimated that Latin America can create 22 million new jobs with a proper green transition by 2030. However, Latin America would lose 7.5 million jobs in very politically sensitive sectors, mining and farming. meat. I'll talk to Argentinians, Uruguayans, Brazilians. Tell to the big farmers, hey, listen, we will create new jobs in green turbines. Yeah, what do we do with all our cows? Complicated. And final point, the green transition is not something generic. When I hear the green transition can make the EU and Latin America closer, not necessarily. What do you mean by green technology? The solar panel market is completely dominated globally by Chinese companies. So it wouldn't help the bi-regional relation. On the contrary, wind power energy would, because European companies are still competitive. And with 3D technology, you can even print the turbines. You design them in Belgrade, you click, and you print the turbine in somewhere in Chile or Argentina to build the wind power plant. But that comes with a cost. And if you want to limit your investment, here is a solution. Small things that can generate great returns in digitalization, in the energy and infrastructure sector, in small and medium-sized enterprises. 99% of all enterprises in Europe and Latin America are small and medium-sized enterprises, and in education and technical training. Let me give you a short example for each. Digitalization. What about creating a bi-regional search engine advertisement manager? What does it mean? It's a Google, basically, that makes job seeker and job offerers meet bi-regionally. That's very easy to do. It's cheap, and that would generate a fantastic creation of jobs in 2 continents. Energy sector. If you want to change your energy grid, that requires investment of billions, not millions, billions of dollars and euros. However, in my former university in Germany, we conducted a study together with Deutsche Bahn, the German train operator. You know that you can save up to 5 million euros a year, 5 million euros a year, with an investment of 200,000 euros? How? You hire a new professor with an assistant who can generate an algorithm to change the train timetable, the scheduling of the train, just by a couple of minutes. That would reduce the cost at peak times in the use of energy. 5 million saved, investing 200,000. The same applies to gas pipeline. It's the same concept. SMEs. There is a fantastic system in Germany, putting public money, and I talked to someone here who comes from a federal state, same as Germany. So the federal government and the government of the state puts 80% of the capital, but that capital is not used to give loans to companies, but it's used to generate more resources in the financial markets. And only those resources are finally given to the final users. That's a brilliant solution that has worked very well since 1948. Education and technical training, that's where the EU can help a lot. Again, small example. I spent many years in Germany. Do you all know Siemens, the company, television? They also do medical equipment. Real case study with Chile. Siemens sells the most advanced technology for medical screening to Chile. And the Chileans said, listen, but there are no instructions. Everything is in German. And Siemens said, no worries, we'll send you the English translation. And the Chilean said, yeah, but our technicians don't understand English. They only read Spanish. Hey, we can train people. We can also translate instruction for that sake. But probably it's better to train people. And of course, there are solutions also in high politics. I mentioned 3 there. But they might be controversial. Whereas functional and incremental points on the agenda are not necessarily controversial. They tend to unite rather than divide. And you can build on that to go up to the political level. Let me skip the point I wanted to make about the EU that can be only a reference but not a model. If you're interested, I'm happy to answer about that during the debate. Let me come to the conclusion so there is more time for discussion. As I said, only tentative conclusions. But the first thing is, let me show you the possible scenarios with which the EU has to deal with in Latin America. The first is pretty obvious, the Chinese presence. And it's very difficult to compete with Chinese. They're extremely smart. And they're working a lot also on their soft power, not just hard power. But there is another problem. The EU likes region-to-region cooperation. But Latin American regionalism, again, is characterized by variety rather than unity. So even for the EU, it's difficult to identify one interlocutor. That could be CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, but CELAC has a very basic institutional structure. And even coordination between Latin American countries, it's quite problematic inside CELAC. I think I'm not saying anything particularly controversial with that. And therefore, I'll come to the final point. The EU cannot export its model as it stands. The EU can be a reference, not a model, and the EU should be humble enough to accept that. Second, if you take a geopolitical approach, that is, you want to guarantee not only the survival, but also the prosperity of your community in the short, the medium, and also the long term, you cannot insist on values and or interest only. But you have to combine both. Because in the long term, your choices in terms of values will make a difference. If today you take side with Russia, you might be the victim of those kind of behaviors in the future. If today you take side or you acquiesce to certain policies that China is undertaking in Latin America, then you cannot complain if you move from a dependency on the United States onto one on China in the future. And there is a risk that this big summit between Latin America and the Caribbean and the European Union are turned from multilateralism into either multi-bilateralism or mini-multilateralism. That is, we all meet together, but I'm actually interested in meeting 3 or 4 of you. But I save time. I meet all of you, I smile, we take pictures, but in fact I only talk to 3 of you. What remains for all the others if we move to this system? And it's not one way, it's not only the EU selecting, but it's also Latin American countries selecting European states. That's possible. In this sense, a functional agenda is non-conflictive. And that's where there is more space, in my view, to deepen and strengthen a relationship that is already quite strong. And final point, I think that if we believe, as I do, that the relationship between Latin America and the Caribbean and the European Union is already good, we should promote that. We should construct a communication campaign that shows how good the relationship already is and build on that to make it even better. Thank you very much for your attention, and I remain at your entire disposal for any comment, even a little bit hot, picky, and controversial. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. This was really a brilliant lecture, and I expect that we are going to have a lot of questions, so I open a Q&A section. Please be free to ask a question. Maybe the ambassador is... We have a microphone, yeah, you can use.
But he doesn't have a question.
Thank you, Professor, for a very interesting lecture. Aleksa Filipovic, Research Associate from this institute. My question would be about the relations of Latin American countries and the BRICS. Does European Union see this as a competition, and what is the real potential of the BRICS? And since we saw, for example, that more and more countries now are actually expressing their interest to join or to participate in some way with this, let's say, new organization of multipolar world. Thank you.
It's easier to follow, I think. Thank you for this question, Alex. You touched upon a very important topic. In my view, there are two things to be said here. First, the BRICS have a roof, a limit, that is the value-based limit. Because if you take the 4 original members, with all due respect, again, South Africa counts much less than the 4 initial members. You have Brazil and India that are democratic, relatively close to the West, and you have Russia and China who take a distance from the West, although with different tones, and are certainly non-democratic countries, at least in the sense that we in the West give to this term. So I think that this is the limit of the BRICS. And at some point, you know, when you reach the limit, you have to take a position. I'm glad that I don't have the ambassador of Brazil here in the room, because I am quite critical of the foreign policy of the current Brazilian administration. And I'm sorry for saying that. I'm a great friend of Brazil. I studied in Brazil. I lived in Brazil. But it's too easy, you know, to talk about world peace and abstain at UN resolutions that condemn Russian invasion. It's too easy, as President Lula did, to say that it takes 2 to fight. No, if you are attacked, it doesn't take 2, it just takes 1. And if you want to go further, it's again too easy to defend the rights of women and then allow Iranian battleship to move in your ports, as Brazil did. So I wonder, Brazil is a champion in this balancing exercise, in trying to make everybody happy. And it has worked relatively well so far. But when the push comes to the shove, there will be a limit. And that's where the limit of the BRIC is. The second thing that you mentioned, and I think this is a very interesting point for the future. The European Union is perhaps the only organization on the planet that has maintained efficacy and efficiency in decision-making when expanding. All other organizations, when they have gained in representation, they have lost in efficiency. Let's take the case of Mercosur, since we have a representative of a country that is a member of Mercosur. When Mercosur tried to expand for real, not just with association agreements, and they accepted Venezuela, what was the result? That Venezuela has actually double suspension from Mercosur. The first for not meeting democratic standards, and the second for not meeting economic rules. So it's really complicated. And the BRICS will experience exactly the same difficulty. As membership grows, also el abanico, the range of interest that will have to be reconciled, will increase. And that will make decision-making processes within the BRICS more and more complex and compromise more difficult to reach. At least that's my take.
Okay, thank you. Now I have 3 questions.
Okay.
Okay, I will use this opportunity because you gave us so many interesting and important information and some broader context. So my first question is, what is your opinion about Russian presence in Latin American and Caribbean region today? The second one, what about Italian own presence separated from the EU in Latin American and Caribbean region because of historic ties? Very few people know actually that the majority of Brazilians have Italian ancestry and not Portuguese or Spanish, and it's the same case with Argentina and Uruguay, etc. And the third question, how do you see differences between Joe Biden's and Donald Trump's strategies toward Latin American and Caribbean region?
Beautiful.
Okay, yeah, so that's it.
Thank you. I got 3 very, very interesting questions. About Russia. I published a book in 2021 called External Powers in Latin America, which is a collection of essays on the presence of extra hemispheric powers in Latin America. And our contributor on Russia made an argument that convinced me absolutely. The presence of Russia in Latin America has essentially 2 characteristics. The first, it is meant to be a nuisance to the US. So Russians have no real strategic interest in Latin America except bothering the United States. Second, the only real presence, really felt presence of Russia is in the media, especially at the level of distortion of news. Russia Today, just not to make names. That's name and shame. Even trade in weapons between Latin America and Russia is actually going down. It's not going up, it's going down. So Russia is selling less weapons. So there is no real strategic economic interest. Of course, in an evolving, fast evolving global scenario, Russia has to look for allies everywhere, the same as the European Union. Why the European Union is now going heavily, massively to Latin America? Because they need allies about Ukraine, they need allies for the green transition, they need to get commodities, they need to get rare metals and materials. That's the story. Italy. Italy is very much a mirror, if you want, of what you see at the European Union level. Italian interest in Latin America is, I would say, constant but limited, with peaks, with ups and downs. That depends on A, the Italian diaspora in Latin America and how vocal that diaspora is. And the second one is the economic contingency. When things go well in Latin America, Italians tend to be more present to invest, buy, and sell. Italy, as many countries as Germany and Portugal, has tried a number of times to relaunch its presence and relations in Latin America, and for exactly the same number of times it has failed to deliver, sadly. The third question is about the US presence and the differences between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Let me tell you, neither Biden nor Trump are unprecedented phenomena. I would say, let's talk about Biden, Obama, and Trump, or Trump and Reagan. There is a pattern in the Republican administration and in the Democratic administration in their attitude towards Latin America. If you take the Democrats, from the Alliance for Progress by President Kennedy to the goodwill policy of President Carter, the sort of smile policy of President Clinton towards Latin America onto the Obama and Biden administration, Democrat administration have been more cooperative. Whereas Republican administration have been definitely more unilateral and assertive. But just to be clear, Trump is nothing new. His very strong rhetoric against certain countries, Mexico or Cuba, is nothing new. President Reagan did even worse than that. President Reagan put mines in the port of Managua in Nicaragua. And it's not my opinion. He was condemned, or the United States was condemned by the UN General Assembly, the International Court of Justice, and the US Congress itself. And from that condemnation, we had the Iran-Contra scandal. So that was an incredible thing. And if you look the interventionist attitude, that goes back to Eisenhower, to the Eisenhower administration in Guatemala back in 1954. So Donald Trump is nothing new. Even his restrictions on trade are the same kind of approach that President Reagan had, who imposed duties and limitation on about 25% of the global trade of the US. And he was the champion of liberalism. So I don't think that Donald Trump and Joe Biden represent two different things. They just represent the current version of an historical pattern.
Thank you. Colleague from Ecuador, please. We need a microphone. No.
Congratulations for the presentation. My name is Manuel Montero from Ecuador, studying in the University of Pech, and actually my research topic is linked with this, with the overlapping of the Latin American integration organizations. So I made a lot of notes. I have like two examples that I will really like your comments about this. The first of all, like about this stereotype that Latin American countries share similar values, because we have the case of the Inter-American Human Rights Court, that it is supposed that was created from the OAS, but actually only 22 states are members, because mostly the Caribbean islands that have the legacy from the Commonwealth and the UK, they still have the death penalty. So that's against the sharing values of liberalism of the European Union. So we will not be talking about like sharing values if you are trading with countries that they have like political prisoners and they have these death penalties, not applying in the last 20 years, but they're not fulfilling the rule of law with this justice institution. And the second one is also your insights or opinion about the EU interest versus values in the case of the normalization of the relationships with Venezuela. Because remembering, like pre-COVID, there was this case of the president of the National Assembly, Juan Guaidó, who was proclaimed president of Venezuela, and quickly EU countries, starting Germany, they recognized him, and there was this campaign of having these diplomats of Guaidó in EU countries, but the conflict in Ukraine started, and there was this pragmatism that they want to get rid of the dependency of Russian oil. So they were knocking doors. Qatar, that has like slightly human rights values, but that's another discussion. And they were knocking the door of Maduro. So they were like interest more than values, and there were this normalization to, okay, you are not the worst enemy because we have to face a worse enemy in that case. So I guess for Latin American countries, this has like a not strengthening, but it has a negative impact on the image of the EU as a peacemaking and a guarantee of values, like fighting for democracy in Venezuela, but now they are like trading with what's supposed to be fighting. So yeah, these two examples, if you have any comments, and thanks again.
Thank you. on the first point, you said it. I mean, there is no commonality of values. I mean, we can discuss about the European Union. We can discuss about Hungary. You live there, so we can do that.
And it's currently the EU president now.
Exactly. Traveling around the world, purporting to represent the EU in Moscow and Beijing and being absolutely sort of blashed by other European institutions. So that's not just a Latin American thing, let's be very clear. But certainly in Latin America, this is clearer. Yes, there are overlapping institutions, but talking about values, you know, values actually do determine, to an extent, Latin American regionalism. What is the problem? That they are the values of the current administration. It is a governmental project, not a state project. Shall we want to mention ALBA? ALBA was an attempt to integrate based on values, probably questionable values, I would dare to say, but still. And we also, as it ended up. By the way, if you're smart enough, as President Correa of Ecuador was, because you can accuse Correa of many things, but not of being a stupid person. That's for sure. He's very well educated and very smart. And when he understood how the thing was turning, he took a distance from ALBA. He was the first president who said, well, all very nice, we use it for ideological purposes, blah, blah, but actually we do something else. And that was the same with the ATPD with the United States. Oh, we don't want a free trade agreement with the US, but we signed this anti-drug treaty that gives us exactly the same benefits. Okay, so values and interest at the regional level this is a mental framework that you can apply to several situations. The case of Venezuela, you mentioned actually the example of Guaido, but I could give you many others. You mentioned Qatar. I mean, we Italy, we Germany, we the European Union, we replace gas from Russia with gas from Qatar, which you said has a slight problem with human rights issue. We even played the World Cup there. Well, no. Thank you for reminding me. That was below the belt. But that's where my Argentinian side could actually say, I also feel champions of the world. So, no, but you're absolutely right. So what you said, I mean, I can only subscribe to your comments entirely. There's nothing I can say, well, but I would add that. No, you're entirely right. One thing I would actually tell you, this is food for thought rather than a comment, but think about it. Those countries that would most need cooperation in certain sectors are precisely those countries that do not cooperate in those sectors because they fear international interference. Countries that want to sell nuclear technology don't sign for non-proliferation agreements. Countries that have human rights issues don't sign for courts of human rights. Countries that know perfectly that the international tribunal could be after them at some point, they don't give this tribunal jurisdiction to remain to these days.
Okay, Misha.
First, I really do have a need to congratulate on fantastic things we heard, and especially on methodology and fantastic way of presenting that, which is also visible in responses, actually, which is not very often possible to see and hear from somebody giving such a concise, precise, but full answers to what we are, asking. So why I gave this small introduction, because I will also abuse the position to ask the 3 questions, just like Rajko did, because you're really interesting. But before that, I need a little bit of comment in the sense that might be interesting, because as we all see here, this is really exchange for all of us. And since you're for the first time in Serbia, which has some very specific position in many ways, as you've been mentioning, Ukraine very much, of course, which is a very big issue. Serbia has you know, the only country in Europe, apart from Lukashenko, and Bosnia and Herzegovina also because of Serbs, which hasn't introduced the sanctions, and in that sense trying to stick more to, let me say, with most of Latin American countries than with European countries, trying to preserve some kind of neutrality. Why I'm mentioning that? Because I was in May 22 in Argentina for 2 weeks in Cordoba and in Baires as well, and at the Cari Center, and I saw, and that time Serbian diplomat that was chargé d'affaires told me actually there was this conference in Warsaw in which Americans mostly tried to organize a bloc for supporting Ukraine and so on. Not a single Latin American country went there, and not only that, nobody participated neither via Zoom, which is very interesting. Even the countries that are very close to, let me say, American position at that time was still Colombia and so on. But even so, in that was, well, we could speak. I don't want to bother you too much with our position, but in that sense, I'm joking, we are more Latin American country. Some people would say that's maybe for some other stuff, but we will leave that aside. It's not maybe political correct, you know, but our special relationship, I mean, generally in the region with Colombian guys and so on, which we are not very proud on that and so on. But I'm jokingly turning back, I saw many moves on preserving, so we have understanding for this kind of let me say, searching for neutrality approach of huge part of Latin America, which is not the case with European Union, which is very strongly apart maybe from Orban standing on that strong support from Ukraine, but we'll speak more about that. My questions actually, going back, I'll try to be more concise. You mentioned USA. And already Raiko asked about this difference in the politics, but apart from this differentiation between the Democrats and Republicans, which I agree is maybe overemphasized in many ways, I would like to hear the reasons, if I could say, of the failure. I think it's a good mark about the move of Americans maybe 10 years ago to return back to change this situation in which Chinese investments are flourishing everywhere, and in which, again, I'm joking very often, you know, you see those changes that Turkish TV series, soap operas as the most dominant, so much not only about China, but other regional global powers, even in soft power, are coming that. And I think that was the time when the Narcos TV show was launched as a way of very interesting and so on. But I think, would you agree that move failed in a way? And you said that there is a permanent decline of American presence in many ways. I would like some comment of yours about these 10 years and what we might perceive or expect in the future concerning that big changes which are about to come, I think, generally, globally, which you mentioned. Then the other question about the China. Why, a little bit of comment in our experience, Serbia is also a place in which I think 70 to 80% of Chinese investments in the Balkans are settled, and we are being perceived as, then again, the place for the expansion of the China here and so on. But I can tell you, Serbs are somebody who can tell you quite a lot about Western hypocrisy when we speak about the values. And I think this is general sense in Africa and Latin America as well. You know, especially Americans and their perception, you just mentioned upon that. So this Chinese approach, without conditioning everybody about the values, understanding that you are the ones to define what your values are inside, is much more productive, I think, in the long term. And that was the point with whom you started, that we have to take care about the combination about not only values, but so on. So in that sense, we feel ourselves very much alike with Latin America, which is, again, we are not big fans of China or whoever, but we see that as, how should I say, good that somebody is not conditioning us finally with anything, especially in hypocritical way, and they want to cooperate for the time. Then again, you're absolutely right. We as I think also our friends in Latin America and many other countries, are not eager to become dependent on China. And what we are hoping for this rise of China and there is to at least balance a little bit and to use from both or more sides if it is possible. I'm just trying to maybe understand why Latin America is also trying to, you know, move around and so on. And the third issue, speaking about the values, when I was there actually 2 years ago, there was a big move of, let me say, feminism and even LGBT agenda that was deeply, dividing those societies, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, many of them. That was very interesting to be seen. So I would like you to hear a little bit more about these internal divisions that are happening within the Latin American societies, especially joining to that very big move of evangelization and the idea that actually almost, I don't know about the numbers, but there is increasing number, especially in Brazil, which is incredible, and the decline of Catholicism down there. I'm sorry for maybe taking too much time, but we are really exploiting you to the utmost, really. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I'm happy to oblige to this exploitation, which is intellectually stimulating and great fun. About the last 10 years of US foreign policy towards Latin America, I'm not quite sure that I would define those last 10 years as a complete failure. For instance, the Obama administration played a very low profile, but it ended up with big successes. Perhaps the most publicized is the normalization of relations with Cuba, Obama's visit, and so on and so forth. But there are smaller things which have had an even greater impact. For instance, the Obama administration has acknowledged that if you want to stop illegal immigration into the United States, you should actually tackle the roots. And the Obama administration approved the $2 billion aid package in 2 years for Central American countries to improve security, to train police, and to create jobs in Central America, in 3 Central American countries. That was Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. But the Obama administration also passed a bill that remained almost unnoticed, that generated great results in Mexico. I don't know if anybody's aware of that, but before the Obama administration, Mexican trucks could not deliver goods into the United States. So they would arrive at the border, they would offload, reload on US registered truck, and the US truck would deliver. Now Mexican trucks can deliver into the United States. By the way, the Obama administration approved the sharing of intelligence with Mexico. That's an incredibly significant step towards confidence building. I mean, sharing intelligence, about illegal human trafficking, illegal narco trafficking, that's something very significant. And of course, the big highlight, the visit in Cuba. Donald Trump has partly, significantly though, reversed those policies. Biden has not been able to re-establish those policies, but I would not say that the Biden administration didn't do much. In fact, the Biden administration did a lot, but these are all small measures with significant and tangible results rather than big political things. The Biden administration has increased very significantly cooperation in environmental issues and to fight climate change, especially with Brazil, but also with other Latin American countries. Just to give you an example, the Biden administration has launched a dialogue to make cities more user-friendly, more smart, and so on and so forth in Latin America. And especially the big Latin American metropolis need that kind of development. So I would not say that it's a complete failure, although I acknowledge that the Biden administration in particular was not able to convey how much they actually did. If you're interested in this specific point, I will share with you an article and a video, you can download it from YouTube, where the Assistant Secretary of State for Latin America actually reivindicates all the things that the Biden administration has done so far, and it's quite interesting. That's one thing. China. I think this is a common misrepresentation that China doesn't impose conditions, because China does impose conditions, both political and economic. China does not impose conditions in the sense that China does not require Latin American and other recipients to comply with human rights standards, freedom of the press standard, and so on and so forth. But China, with its one China policy, forces country to recognize Beijing as the only legitimate representative of China. In fact, in South America, the only country remaining that exactly recognizes Taiwan as the legitimate representative of China is Paraguay. And by the way, Taiwan is significantly paying for that recognition. I mean, I talked to a number of people in the Paraguayan government, and they said, listen, we're not stupid. If we do this, we, of course, gain something. Nobody's silly here.
Yeah, there was a move in Macedonia 20 years ago. You know this, you know, I'll tell you how
Yeah, please do.
it lasted for a couple of years, but then failed,
Please do. And then, of course, there is the problem with economic conditions. So most loans that China gives are conditional to A, build infrastructures approved of Beijing and useful for Beijing. So these are not sort of grid structure, but this is a direct structure that is copy-pasted from the British Empire. So you connect the mining areas to the ports in order to facilitate export to Beijing, or at the time of the British Empire, to London. That's what China is doing. China imposes as a condition that countries that receive Chinese loans hire Chinese companies. I mean, so I give you with one hand and I take it with the other. So, I mean, and by the way, Chinese companies tend to bring their own manpower. So it has a very limited benefit for the local communities.
we know all of this, I can tell you quite a lot, but they are not, you know, politically in that sense conditioning with the whole package, double standings and so on. Sorry.
And you're right, they're very good at marketing. Chinese soft power is great. It's what the European Union is missing completely. The European Union does so much, and probably better than others, but we are unable to convey the message. The message doesn't go through. I mean, if you look at Latino Barometer, which is the big survey conducted in Latin America on virtually any relevant topic, well, Latino Barometer has seen that there is a positive assessment of the role of the EU, but both elites and common citizens in Latin America perfectly realize that if you want to play with the big guys, you have to play with the US and with China. And that's the thing. So that's really problematic. And the third question was, so the US, China, and feminism. Protestantism, feminism, yeah. Yeah, internal divisions. I think that the major cleavage that you can see politically these days in Latin America is an anti-incumbent cleavage. In every single election in Latin America in the last 4 years, the incumbent lost and the opposition won, with one possible exception, although we have to discuss that. That's again Paraguay, but a different current inside the Colorado party won. So Abdo Benitez, basically they said, your guys are out, and the new president brought his own people. But so in a way that confirms the pattern. So that's the major cleavage I see. There is a clear sense of dissatisfaction with that. Then you have new, I wouldn't be sure whether I would call them cleavages or I would use another definition, but we understand each other. Certainly the rise of Protestantism is very important, but Protestantism is actually able to provide people with the answers they need. And Catholicism fails more and more to do that. And this is not only a problem in Latin America. I think we have the same problem in Europe. It's a problem that Christianity is facing. which leads to another problem and another cleavage inside Latin America and also outside Latin America, that people tend to misunderstand the needs of the common people in Latin America. I think of Brazil. In Brazil, especially after the big depression of 2015-16, the level of safety went down so much that in certain cities, you don't know whether you return home in the same condition as you left home. Corruption was and arguably still is galloping, and the economic conditions were absolutely bad. So people who had reached a sort of middle-class status under Lula dropped back into poverty. Now, the Bolsonaro discourse was, I will fight for economic recovery. Doesn't matter the environment, doesn't matter politically correct, and so feminism, LGBT, and so on and so forth, plus. He said, I will restore safety and security, and I will fight against corruption. These were the three things that people wanted to hear. It's not that 50 and something million voters in Brazil voted for someone close or to certain position. They voted for someone who gave answers. And in that sense, there is a clear division to me, and you can appreciate it, between those segments of society in Latin America, but also in Europe, I can see that in Italy, that perceive those issues as real problems, and those segments, generally the better off, who do not see them. I mean, if you come from the favelas, villas, chabolas, poblaciones, you perceive insecurity, you perceive inflation much more than if you drive your Mercedes from the nice area to downtown. And that's true also for Italian situations. I mean, we mentioned Hungary. I can mention the example of my own country. The party that is currently in government, although in coalition, comes from a traditional nucleus, electoral nucleus of 4%. So how comes that now they're close to 30? It's obvious that the other 26 are not actually active members or believers in that party, but they tend to find the answers that other more traditional or established parties and political formation don't give. And this is the cleavage I really see, and it's a dangerous cleavage, because most of these answers tend to be sort of simplistic answers. They completely miss the complexity of the situation. Thank you. Very, very interesting question. Thanks.
Okay, now our colleague Peter, yeah, he's the next one. Then we can continue with others.
Thank you, Professor, for your really inspiring lecture. My name is Petar Ćurčić, and I am researcher at the Institute of European Studies. I would like to ask you more about, we are discussing here about the relations between EU and Latin American countries, as well as Caribbean countries. But after the Brexit, we have really significant issue about the role of the UK and how UK perceives itself in its role in world politics. So I would like to thank you, because due to the fact that UK is really particularly present in Latin America historically, especially in Caribbean region, but not only in Caribbean region, but also in Argentina with Falkland Islands, also a really open disputed issue between two countries. The last European country that waged war against one Latin American country was UK. It was a huge success of them. So I would like to ask you about the idea of the global Britain in practice. How you see officially London politics with Latin American countries, and is that any possibility? So is UK some kind of disruptor of EU in relationship between with Latin American countries, or it is some kind of supporter and an ally in that process? Thank you very much.
I'll answer this first and then I'll take yours. Thank you. I'm not able to comment on the success and impact of global Britain strategy in other regions of the world. It's not really my expertise. I can tell you that nothing has changed in Latin America. So the UK has basically translated European policies at the national level. Global Britain was a fantastic label, but this has not resulted in major alteration of policy. Also because the change in the UK foreign policy towards Latin America has happened at least for the last 10 years. You may know Chatham House. This is the major think tank in Britain in terms of international relations, and Chatham House advised the UK to invest and focus in Latin America and explore new opportunities. I gave testimony before the House of Lords a few years ago on this topic. What is the big thing of the EU in Latin America, of the UK in Latin America? That the UK is present across the board. So if you think of China, India, even Turkey, they are present in very specific sector. That is mining, agriculture, and energy, essentially. The UK has a wider portfolio. It's very much present in the financial markets. If you look, for instance, the São Paulo Stock Exchange market, if you look at the integrated market of Latin America, that is the stock exchange platform of Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. The UK is very much active in that sector. The UK is very much active in the tourist sector. So major tourist facilities in Latin America are actually owned and built by British companies. To complement your comments and the comments that our Ecuadorian friend made before about the Caribbean and the fact that some Caribbean states are part of the Commonwealth, let me tell you that those states still have as head of state the King of Britain. So that's pretty interesting also in legal and juridical terms.
Yeah, I would like to add just one thing, if I can. During the crisis between Guyana and Venezuela, British Army was ready to help to Guyana because it's part of Commonwealth to protect its borders in Guyana Essequibo region. So
absolutely,
they are interested as well in the security traditionally, of course, with their presence in Falkland Islands and Malvinas.
Thank you very much. If I can build on your comment, it's very interesting. I said at the very beginning that history matters and nothing happens in a vacuum. The British position is exactly the same that Britain took in the 1800s, when actually the situation was the same. Venezuela trying to get territory from the British Guyana. The difference is that in the 1800s, the Brits did not react. Venezuela asked the US President Grover Cleveland to go for arbitrate. That arbitration said that Venezuela was right, and parts of the oil fields in the Orinoco River now belong to Venezuela and not to Guyana. So you see, history is repeating itself. Nothing new under the sky.
Please.
There. I have another question now. Well, since we know that, let's say, France has some territory still in South America, what would you say is their political importance in that region? How they impact the region with the small territories they kept in the south of America? And I have another question. You can answer this, or I can ask right away. How do you want?
Okay, sure. So I'll try to shrink the answer. France has had a very important role traditionally in Latin America, especially in the cultural area. France is a point of reference in cultural and ideational terms in Latin America. If you think of the three principles of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, these are three main principles of Latin American, not only politics and constitutional principles, but of Latin American societies. Los hermanos, la hermandad, no? Equality, that's basically, and liberty. By the way, libertad is the word most frequently mentioned in Latin American national anthems. Okay, so you see that. By the way, if you take the literature, Jorge Amado, the Brazilian writer, his debut novel called O País do Carnaval, the Carnival Country, actually is the story of a young Brazilian studying in France, learning a lot of interesting new things, and he wants then to apply this new knowledge in Brazil. But he felt a stranger, a Brazilian in France, and a French in Brazil upon return. That said, the current situation is quite complex. France is present, but not as much as you may think in terms of economic presence, although France has a very significant clout in determining EU policies towards Latin America. The agreement with Mercosur is now stopped essentially by the French veto and some other countries, but France is certainly the most vocal. You may remember the personal quarrel between Bolsonaro and Macron and some appreciation about Macron's wife. That was really on the personal level, really, really sad. But France lives a lot on these kind of things, you know, big statement, big political positions, but the real economic impact, I would say, is more limited than you may think when you look at the political discourse.
For the second question, now that we introduce all the major powers, let's say USA, China, Russia, my question is based on, do you think that the world finally became bipolar more than multipolar because of the creation of BRICS and the vast power is like split the world in half, let's say, ideologically at least?
Yes, I do. I think that we are now facing a bipolar situation quite clearly. However, let me make a very clear statement here. I don't think that this is leading to another Cold War, or not necessarily. This is not inevitable, okay? It really depends on how things will be managed, because there are very significant differences between that bipolarism and this one. Not least the ideological one. There is no big ideological difference between China and the US when you translate that ideology in tangible, practical international action. Thank you. Very good comment.
Thank you.
So I will give the final word to... Oh, it's okay. Okay. Yelena. There it is.
To ask you a question, because you mentioned in several occasions the war in Ukraine, and how Latin American countries, I think most of them voted in favor of the General Assembly resolutions. In the case of Argentina, all 6 resolutions during the previous government were voted in favor and co-sponsored by Argentina. And we might disagree in many, not with you, I mean us in Argentinians, in many foreign policy issues, but there are issues in which do not disagree. We cannot disagree because of the issue of Malvinas, so we cannot vote in favor of abstain from a resolution condemning aggression. But the war is entering its 3rd year, and how it's going to end up is pretty uncertain. So my question is, what happens if Russia finally wins? What are the consequences for Europe? Because that it was not seen as a possibility, I think, a year ago, but now it's more and more possible that Russia might win, or that we'll have a frozen conflict, and then it will be it put the European Union in a very difficult position vis-a-vis the candidate status that Ukraine has, with 20% of Ukraine occupied by Russia. So I was so impressed by your read. It was brilliant. Then that time I'm tempted to know your opinion on this, even though it's not exactly your subject today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Let me answer half seriously and half jokingly. Okay, the serious answer is, if Russia wins this war, and by winning, I mean gets most of its objectives, essentially territorial gain, the consequences will be catastrophic for the EU credibility more than anything else. I don't think that there will be terrible economic consequences, that we will find an arrangement sooner or later, but in terms of credibility, the consequences will be catastrophic for the EU and for the West in general. I think also the US may actually feel the backlash of that. The half-jokingly answer is that, you know, thanks God, I'm an academic and not a consultant. So I don't have, you know, the crystal ball, and I'm not required to predict the future in a way. And then let me tell you a final point that applies to both to Europe and Latin America. I was Carlos Saavedra Lama's chair. And Carlos Saavedra Lamas, for those of you who don't know who this gentleman is, was the first Latin American ever to win a Nobel Prize. He was the foreign minister of Argentina between 32 and 38. He won the Nobel Prize for Peace in 1936. And why I mentioned this gentleman? Because he was perhaps the best proponent of the Latin America anti-war tradition. And rejecting war does not mean only condemning invasion, but in the eyes of Saavedra Lama, that means creating the conditions for peace. And those creations are given by interdependence. If you depend on others for either your trade or your well-being, you will be unwilling to jeopardize that condition. So let me finish with that. If Latin America and the Caribbean could retrieve this very important tradition, Latin America would also be able to take a more prominent position and role on the world stage. Thank you.
Of course.
Just to add, this might be interesting. Yesterday I had a chance to speak with the gentleman from Ukrainian embassy, fantastic guy generally, who told me when we spoke about European prospects and so on, said, yeah, but generally, yeah, but they then tell us, you know, mostly Finnish, like, well, we will have to wait for you to win the war against the Russia, you know. So in that sense, you know, they are very, how should I say, aware about that nice prospects opening, but in reality, at this moment, nobody's really willing to do anything about that. And one thing also about returning back to the values, sorry, and I'm finished with that, you know, the only condition that Ukraine has to fulfill from Brussels to get the candidacy status was to ratify Istanbul Convention, which they 2 times with overwhelming majority refused to ratify in the parliament. Well, is democracy, you know, European value? Is European rule of law European value? That's really big issue nowadays. Sorry for skipping.
Okay. Once again, Professor, thank you so much for your presentation and so many information that you gave to us. And thank you all for coming once again. And I hope that in the future we will organize something similar. Thank you once again.